When politicians talk about race in America, Asian Americans are noticeably absent from the conversation.
And that is, how do we expand economic opportunity for African Americans and Latinos across America?
I'm going to help the African Americans. I'm going to help the Latinos, Hispanics.
And African American Latino students too often lagged behind our white classmates.
There's this idea that Asian Americans don't need help, that they've already got it figured out. After all, if you look at the headlines out there, they seem to be doing pretty well. And this is supposedly backed by numbers that say they're the wealthiest and most educated racial group. Except, if you look at the details, the picture changes.
At its very start, it actually doesn't, the idea of the model minority doesn't stem from any demographic evidence. It's a political fiction that emerged in the 60s.
Claims of Asian American success are based on data that groups all of them together under one umbrella. So if you think of Asian America as a demographic of 48 countries, most detailed data reports only on the 6th largest ethnic groups. Or sometimes they're left out altogether. But when you separate the data by ethnic subgroups, the differences are stark. Look at this chart. Indian Americans might have relatively high household incomes, but that number drops significantly when you look at Bangladeshi Americans. And while Asian Americans seem to be more educated when grouped together, less than 15% of American Cambodians, Hmongs, and Laotians have a bachelor's degree. Compare that to 72% of Indian Americans and 53% of Chinese Americans. American Hmongs, Cambodians, Laotians, and Vietnamese have poverty rates higher than the US average. And here's what it looks like when you look at uninsured Asian Americans by subgroup.
So the data is in many ways a way of reverse engineering this argument that Asian Americans are doing better than other groups of color, which then pits them against those groups of color and then makes this argument that if Asian Americans can do so well, why can't these other groups do well, including, Latinos and Blacks?
But it's not just Pew or the census or any one organization. It's a whole convoluted network of national, state, and local agencies that don't have guidelines to consistently report on racial or ethnic categories. A lot of times, organizations like the US Census actually do collect info on different subgroups, but that data isn't always reported.
So the question is not about whether data is collected. Data is collected oftentimes, and it's collected in a disaggregated way. Sometimes the issue is it's not publicly reported. So there's always that extra steps for community-based organizations or individuals that want that granular data to be able to get it.
There are a number of reasons for this. Polling Asian Americans can present its own challenges. There are language barriers and issues with getting large enough sample sizes. So one of the challenges is collecting the data, and the other is making sure it's reported. But this data matters. It has actual, tangible effects on policy and resources. Asian Americans are highly diverse, and when agencies group them all together, it hides the needs of subgroups that might actually need help. Here's an example: funding for HIV and AIDS research. In the 1980s, when HIV stats were reported in federal updates, Asian Americans were lumped into the other category, and they were underrepresented in federal funding. But that changed when the data was reported separately.
Once that data was starting to be generated by Asian American organizations, proving that there was need in the community and that they were vulnerable, that's when the funding started to come.
Data is a really powerful tool. Data is used to determine policy priorities. It helps determine resource allocations. And so as an Asian American community, when we're not included in that data, we're being left out. And in many respects, we're invisible. And our invisibility has become institutionalized because we don't have the ability when we go and seek services to be able to check off a box that says, I'm Filipino, for example, or I'm Korean.
If you can't quantify the problems that are happening within the community, it becomes a challenge to prove to people that the solutions and the policies that you're proposing are actually going to have an impact.